Hello everybody, this is Brad Tallis. I apologize, we are having some technical difficulties and now for whatever reason my camera is not working. Originally Angelo was going to present today, but he's having some issues with his iOS. So this topic was going to be about, give me just a second here, let me see if I can get my camera working. Let me go back to my Brio. There we go. Let's see if that's projecting now. Originally, we were going to do some stuff with Cam, learning to everything about the setup menu. But like I said, we're having some technical difficulties with his computer. So we're going to change the topic. I apologize, and I'll update the name on the video and all that kind of stuff. And so what we're going to do now is Stump the Chump. So literally not more than a few minutes ago, I downloaded a bunch of sample models, or sample drawings, I should say, because somebody posted on the chat on our last live stream that they said, hey, you should do some of the SolidWorks Model Mania challenges. And I was like, oh, that's a great idea. So I went out there and I actually did some of them. It was kind of fun. And I was going to present that next week. However, there's a big copyright thing on their webpage saying that this is only for SolidWorks users and nobody else. So unfortunately, I can't use their models and walk through them. So I did find some other models out on the web, and I'm going to pick this. I mean, literally, I have not practiced this. I haven't tried it. I haven't done anything with it. So this is going to be me live going through how would I model this, and I might stumble, I might trip up and stuff like that, but we're going to kind of solve these together. So let me switch here. Here is the PDF document. So I actually got these off of this webpage, the studycadcam.com. Now it is in a different language. In fact, you can kind of see the drawing title and all that kind of stuff. So you'll either want to use like Google Translate or just pick on pictures and stuff like that. But there are hundreds of sample models out there. And you can go out and practice. Some of them are easy, some of them are a little bit more difficult. And I looked at this one and I said, okay, how would I approach this? It's not overly complicated. We're going to probably do a side profile and revolve it. This is my guess. And then I'm probably going to have to create these little air vents or whatever they're called. But you'll notice that they're slightly tapered. In fact, it's kind of hard to see right here. It looks like they're at a 7-degree taper. So I'm going to have to figure out how are we going to go about doing that. And then obviously I would probably pattern. Let the software do the hard work here. So I'm looking over the chat really quick. So Angelo, if you're able to join, let me know in the chat and we'll see if we can switch back over to the manufacturing side of things. I'd be willing to do that if necessary. So, okay. So I'm going to be using this drawing now. I'll go ahead and attach it to the video after we're all done. So let me switch to Fusion. Okay, and I'll jump back and forth between the drawing and the model and stuff like that. So like I mentioned, I'm probably going to start with a side profile of this, and we can kind of see like the overall shape of it and all this kind of stuff. Looks like the overall diameter is 240. It looks like some of these openings are at 123. So I'm just going to basically use these dimensions to help me to start drawing this profile. What I'm going to do is pretty much just kind of mock it up first. I'm just going to sort of sketch what it sort of looks like, and then we'll come back and define it with dimensions, etc. So, okay. Looks like Angelo's trying to talk. So give me just a second, guys. Let me see if... Okay, so there is Angelo. Angelo, you're on mute right now. but you are part of the Zoom meeting. And I don't know if I can hear you. Okay. So we'll see. Are you able to share your screen and do all that kind of stuff or not? Okay. I'm not hearing anything. Okay, so I'm going to keep moving forward here. Sorry, guys. Okay, so let me jump back to Fusion, and I notice in the drawings that it is in metric, so I'm going to change my units to millimeters. So we can do that there. I'll say okay. I like to start everything as a component, so I'm going to say new component, and then I can give this a name. Now, do I have to do a component? No, this is a single part, single example, but I'm doing this just to get used to the process of always creating things as components, because it'll help me in the long run down the road. So I'm going to give it a name. I'll call it part 756, because that's what it is. I'll say okay. And now you'll notice I have a component. And if I create a new sketch on my front plane, you'll see that that sketch is going to be underneath that component. And again, that's going to help me out. So, okay. I'm going to go ahead and start, like I mentioned before, I'm just going to sort of mock up what this thing looks like. So I'm going to basically hover over this center point here, or the starting point, and you'll see, it's kind of hard to see, but there's a little snap guide that sort of appears. And so it's basically saying you're right above that 0, 0. So I'll come over a little bit, I'll come down a little bit, come over, and now notice like that green checkbox is kind of in the way. So if I were to click right now, it would actually end my selection. So I might want to zoom up just a little bit to get that checkbox out of the way. Then I'll come over here, I'll come down, and then finally I want to draw this little foot, and I want it to be at the same level as that. So I'm just going to hover. I don't have to click. I'm just going to hover, and it's hard to see, but it's going to create a snap guide. So you can see it's going to kind of snap down to that point right there. I'll go to that point right there, and you'll notice that my profile is not filled in. And this is because it's not closed. If I draw my line up here, now you'll see that it's fully closed. And when I go to revolve this, I want to make sure that it's fully closed. Okay? So, now what I want to do is, I got the constraints were automatically created. This line says that it's horizontal. It's perpendicular to this vertical line. All of these corners are perpendicular. So I can kind of see that here. So I drew it pretty good. Now I want to start typing in dimensions. So for example, I'll come in here and let's just throw a dimension on this edge. I'll place that dimension, and it's supposed to be 8. Now watch what happens when I hit enter. You'll notice my whole sketch kind of got a little bit bigger. Okay, this is a neat feature we recently added. Previously, if I had done that, sometimes the scale would change so much that, you know, this line would end up above this line, and it would be kind of crazy. There is an option in preferences. So I'm going to turn on my preferences here, and I think it's under design. Let me scale entire sketch at first dimension. And I have that turned on. Okay. And so you could kind of see when I first put my dimension, it was around 4 point something. And so then when I typed in 8, it actually scaled the whole thing up. Now, what I'm trying to explain is sometimes, you know, previously, if you don't have that turned on, you might throw a dimension on, like, for example, this line right here, and it would do something like this. Okay. As soon as I typed in like the height of that line, I get a really weird result. So by doing that auto scale at first dimension, it keeps my profile looking the way it should, but it just scaled it up a little bit. Okay, so again, using my drawing, I'm going to, let's just do maybe this top line to the bottom. That looks like that's supposed to be, my eyesight is really bad, 116. Okay, and here's a prime example of, see how that kind of went down and it really sort of shrunk that dimension right there. So maybe instead I should do, let's go ahead and do maybe a dimension here first. So let's do, and I think that guy is 105. So let's take a look at that. So I'll throw a dimension from here to here, and I'll type in like 105. And we can see that that went down. And now if I set this dimension to be the 115 or 116, I'm sorry, we'll see that that, you know, kept a pretty good shape right there. Okay. I'm gonna do a dimension from here to here. And if I right mouse click, you'll notice I can actually type in a diameter dimension. So watch what happens when I say diameter dimension. You'll notice that even though I clicked this blue line here and then this other blue line there, instead of dimensioning between those two, on the drawing it's actually giving me a diameter of, in this case, 80. So let me see what happens with that. Okay, that brings that over. And then I need to have, to look again, I have not looked at this drawing hardly at all, so I'm trying to figure out where the next dimension is at, so bear with me. So what I'm doing here is, so here's that 80 dimension that I was just talking about. So here's my center line, and I just typed in 80. So what I'm actually looking for is, where is this next point right here? And I'm hoping they provide that. Okay, so it looks like that might be, no, that's that guy there. Wow, I hope this is a fully dimensioned drawing. I might have to, and I'm not drawing this hole in here right now. You can kind of see that. If anybody sees it, shout it out in the chat, because I am not finding it. I might just make an assumption of what that's going to be, because I do not see it, guys. Not there, not there. Okay, I'm basically, this is 8 millimeters down. I'm gonna just make that 8 millimeters across, and maybe there's a dimension missing on this drawing. Now you'll notice this kind of tucked in, so I'm just gonna grab that point and drag it to the right, and you can see that that allows me to, you know, kind of fix that point, for example. So I might just throw a dimension here, let's just say 8 in this case. Okay, so I'm just gonna stick with that, and then what it looks like they're doing, they're kind of giving me dimensions on the inside and on the outside. So I can kind of see here 174, that's to the inside. Now I'm hoping to do this and shell the whole part out instead of drawing a complicated profile and trying to, you know, keep equal wall thicknesses or whatever. But in this case, it looks like they're dimensioning to the inside, and I'm not sure what the wall thickness is. So again, I'm kind of struggling here to figure out how was this part created. So it looks like, so that's 8 there. Okay, and that's 8 there. That's good. So let's do this. I'm going to, well, I'll just keep the 174. Let's just see what happens here. So I'm going to do a dimension down here. Okay, I'll right mouse click. Actually, I lied. I'm sorry. So let me show you what happened right there. So I did dimension and I clicked on this line. And so it was basically saying it wanted to dimension the length of this line. And when I right mouse clicked, you'll notice I didn't get the option to do a diameter. However, if I were to instead select the distance from that line to the distance to that line, and I right mouse click, now you can see that I get a diameter dimension, because you can kind of think of it as a radial dimension around this guy right here. So I'm going to say diameter. We'll go ahead and place that guy. 174. Let's see what happens here. Okay, so that narrows down the overall length of it. You can kind of see what that looks like. And then I obviously need to bring this line in a certain distance. And this is the one that I just don't see. I'm sorry, I apologize. I dimensioned this incorrectly. Let me drag this guy down. This is supposed to be the overall, which is 240. 240, there we go. Makes more sense now. And then I could do another dimension. I'll go from here to here. That is supposed to be the 174. Now that's a weird result. Let me try that again. I'll say dimension, there to there, diameter. Wow, I don't know why I'm getting that result. Let me see what happens when I type in a number. Let's go 174. Yep, that looks good. Not sure. Oh, it is the order that I clicked it. I can, there we go. So we can see that it's coming off of the center there. So let me try the order of that dimension again. So if I say from here to here, and then I say diameter dimension, notice it is correct. What I was doing was I was starting with this line and then going to that line there. And so it was assuming that this was my radial, you know, my axis that I was dimensioning around. So you definitely want to click the axis first and then the other line. So we're all learning together with this. So I'm going to type in 174. That looks good. And then the overall height, I do not see dimensioned on here. So I picked a poor drawing. Let me see. It has an angle. So what I'm basically looking for is how far up do we go on this point right here. Okay, so here we go. It looks like 66.8. So I'll throw that dimension on there. So I'll say a dimension from there to there should be 66.8, and you'll see that it pushes that line up higher. Okay. So, like I said, this is literally the first time I've looked at this drawing instead of saying download and save. So I struggled a little bit trying to figure out how is this thing designed. I've now fully dimensioned this thing. So you can kind of see as we go in here, it is totally turned from blue to black, which means that my sketch is constrained. If I go in here, I can see this little lock symbol. That also means that the sketch is constrained. So for example, if I were to, let's delete that dimension, you'll notice that that lock symbol went away and it looks like a little pencil. It means you still need to edit this sketch to fully constrain it. So as soon as I put that 8 dimension on there, it says I have all the information that I need and I don't need to, nothing's gonna change basically, okay? Okay, so we learned a couple things. We learned about the diameter dimension, where we learned we have to click on this line first and then that line second. You would right mouse click and actually have to be in the dimension. You click that line, you right mouse click, and you can select diameter dimension. And that comes in really handy with some of these drawings, how they are dimensioned, such as this guy here. Obviously, I could have figured it out and said that's 40 and that's 25 and all that kind of stuff. But let's not add in potential for mistakes. Let's let Fusion do the work for us. Now you'll also notice that there's some radiuses on here. Now I am not going to include those radiuses when I create this, okay? I'm gonna use a 3D command instead of a 2D command. You've heard me say this multiple times. I like to keep my sketches simple, and I don't want all of these extra things on here. So I'm gonna say finish sketch, okay? Then we'll go to create and revolve. Now we do lots of extrusions. The extrusions are easy and stuff like that. I haven't done very many revolves, but these are a great command for doing like cylindrical objects like this guy is. So what's the profile? Well, it's already selected. What's the axis? I'll go ahead and click on this axis right here and you'll see that it's going to swing that around. And we have some options here. So we have angle. We could swing it to another object if we wanted to. Or we could say go fully around, no matter what. Now by default, it says angle, and you can actually specify what that angle is going to be. For example, 180 degrees. Okay. Or even 90 degrees. Now, what's kind of cool is if this was a really complicated model, I could do maybe just this one quadrant, add all my detail to it, and then mirror it over to this other side, and I'd have 180. And then I could mirror that again over to this side, and I'd have 360. But in this case, we'll do a full round, or all the way around, and say OK. And now you can see under my component, it has its own origin, which is right in the center. It has its own body, okay? And it has any sketch or sketches that have to do with this part. Okay, so what is next? Well, there's a couple options here. Now, what I'm a little bit nervous because I said I want to shell this part out, but you'll notice that this foot here is a little bit thicker. I'm really kind of curious what's going to happen to me here. So we're going to have to figure out what's going to go on there. And it's also a little bit thicker up here. Now, when should I do this shell? And that's one of the questions you'll want to ask as you're parametrically designing this model. So I'm going to actually do the shell fairly soon. But should I do the shell before I do these fillets, or should I do them after? Well, I'm going to do these fillets first. And here's a prime example. This radius 6, you can kind of see rounds over this corner. Let me zoom up here and see if we can actually see the detail. Let me zoom down. It might be a little hard to see, but it's also probably curved on the inside. So if the outside is curved and then I specify my wall thickness, it'll actually bring that fillet onto the inside also. So in this example, I want to add my defining fillets first. Okay, let me zoom back out here. So I'm going to add in some of these fillets. So that's going to be my next step. And this will make more sense as we move forward here. So I can see that this is a radius of 6. So I'm going to pre-select that edge, say fillet. And I can either drag the arrow to kind of visually see what that's going to look like. And then I can start typing stuff in. Okay, so that's a radius of 6. That's a radius of 6. So I'm going to do both at the same time. Now this top edge is a radius of 4. Now I could do that as a separate fillet. Let me show you what I mean by that. I'm going to say OK. And here are my two 6mm fillets. Then I could come in here and say I want that to be a radius of 4. I'll say OK. And you can see a smaller fillet there. And I have 2 fillet features in my timeline. And that's totally fine. Or I'm going to go ahead and delete that. I could have done my 2 edges at 6, and then I can hit this little plus symbol. And that's going to let me pick another selection, and you'll notice a new cell basically appears, and I can say I want that to be 4. And so it's going to do 2 of them at 6 and 1 of them at 4. And then this top one is 2. So I'm going to go ahead and hit that little plus symbol. I'll click this top edge, and let's just make that 2. And so you'll see when I say OK, I still only have 1 fillet feature in my timeline. But inside of that, I've got multiple different sizes. So it's really up to you what you find easier. Do you want most of your fillets, in one feature, or do you want to see 3 or 4 fillet features here that you could come back and edit easily? Again, like I said, it's up to you. Okay, so now I have kind of the defined shape of this. Let's go ahead and shell this guy out. Okay, so I'm going to click on this bottom face. Then I'm going to right mouse click, and you'll notice one of the options is shell. So So I'm going to go ahead and click on that. And I don't, again, I haven't had time to investigate. I honestly don't know what the wall thickness is. And I'm not sure where I would find that. And so I apologize. So again, I'm going to make some assumptions. You know, this might be a 2mm wall thickness. Now, what I think's going on here is, what I'm missing is there's this 174. I don't know what this outside wall diameter is, and I honestly don't see it on the drawing. I might be missing it, but I'm gonna just say this is maybe 2 or 3. We'll play around with it. And how am I coming up with that? Well, I can see that this is 8mm right here, and so I'm just basically gonna say at least half of that, maybe even more than half of that. So that's what I'm doing here. So let's start dragging and see what happens. I'm going to start dragging this little distance here, and you'll see that it's actually physically shelling that part out. Okay, kind of rotating around so you can kind of see what that looks like. Okay, so let's do this. This will be kind of fun. I'm going to cancel that. I'm going to inspect and do a section analysis. Now it says, what face do you want to slice through? Well, I don't have a flat face in the direction that I want to slice, but I can click on this origin plane right here, and you can see that it's going to slice right through the middle of my part, and I can see inside of it. So I'm going to go ahead and say OK. So obviously this is a solid revolution. Now when I come in here and say shell, and I start to drag, we can visually see what that wall thickness looks like. I can even come in here and look at the front. So obviously 8 is way too big. Let's try 4. That even looks a little bit too big. So I think I was correct in saying that this is about 3mm in wall thickness, and that's what I'm gonna go with. So kind of a cool way to see inside your model. I'll go ahead and say OK, and we've shelled that part out. Now, I get this question a lot. I section, but now I can't see my whole part. All you have to do is click this little eyeball next to analysis, and you can actually turn your section analysis on or off using these little eyeball icons. So it still exists, and I can come in and turn it on and off at any time. Okay. So we have the basic shape. Now let's start kind of doing some other things here. Now I noticed this chamfered hole right here. I could have tried to draw this guy in my profile, but remember I said keep your sketches simple. We could use the hole command to create this, okay? And check out how fast and how easy this is. So I'm going to click on that face, I'll right mouse click, and there is the hole command. So I'm going to say hole, and I get this weird little preview, and it's kind of hard to see what's going on, but you see that little red icon right there. Well, I'm going to type in my diameter. So it looks like it's supposed to be a 50 diameter. So I'm going to type in 50, and it updates, and I get this interesting result. But here's the cool trick. I'm going to start dragging this blue dot around, and you'll see that white dot kind of appear in the middle, and it'll snap right to that. So I just have to drag that over, and it'll snap right to the center of that cylinder. Okay. It also shows on the drawing that there is a small chamfer, a 4mm chamfer there. So I'm going to come over here, and you can see we can do a simple, a counter bore, or a countersink. And watch what happens to this little icon here when I click on countersink. It gives me a little bit of a preview of what that's going to look like. However, you'll notice it doesn't give me the height right here. And I want that to be a 4mm chamfer. So in this case, I'm going to leave it a simple hole. I'll say OK. Also, taking a look at the drawing, I can see that this is thicker right here. And I have a thin wall, so that you're going to see something happen here. I'm going to go ahead and jump back to Fusion. If I were to come in here and say chamfer, and we type in a distance of 4, you'll notice that it turns red. Okay? The fillet chamfer could not be created at the requested size. Why? Well, I'm trying to create a 4mm chamfer on a 3mm thick section there. And that's why it failed. Okay, so I would say one of the drawbacks with our shell command is you can't specify multiple thicknesses. It's literally just, it's going to be 3mm thick throughout the part. So how could I fix this? Well, I could do something like an offset. So I'm going to go ahead and grab this face, and I could say press pull. Now I'm kind of looking up underneath it, and I'm going to start dragging this down, and you'll notice as I'm dragging it down, it's changing the thickness of everything. In fact, let me turn the section analysis on. I grab this face and I say press pull. Watch what happens. See how it's changing the thickness of everything? And that is not what I want. Okay? The reason for that is this offset type is set to automatic. So I'm going to do the exact same thing again. I'll say press pull. I'm going to change from automatic, and let's try the first one, modify existing feature. And I start to drag and I get the same result. So obviously that's not correct. Let me do that again. I'll say press pull, and I'm going to say new offset. And I'm going to start to drag, and notice the result that I get now. Okay? So be real aware when you're doing offset face, if you're wanting the whole thing to change, you could leave it to automatic. But in this case, I was really kind of observant what was going on. And here I'm saying, I want to do a new offset. Well, how far? Well, remember I said I want this to be a certain thickness? What this is telling me is that I've offset it 5mm from where it was originally. So I'm going to come in here and say re-anchor to this top face. And now it's saying this blue face is 8mm from this top face. So if I came in here and said I want that to be 10, watch what happens. Okay? It adds some thickness, and I know that it's 10mm from this top face to this blue face. That re-anchor command is extremely, extremely useful. I could have done the math. I could have said, okay, it's currently 8, I'm adding 3, blah, blah, blah. But again, that could cause issues. I could be bad at math. I could type it in wrong or whatever. Let Fusion do the work for you. So I'm going to go ahead and say, I want that to be 10mm thick. I'll say OK, and I get that result there. Let's go ahead and try our chamfer now. And it's supposed to be a 4mm chamfer, and notice this time it doesn't complain. Okay? Because there's enough material there now. Hopefully this is making sense. Hopefully Angelo's answering the questions that are popping up. I know this is not the topic that you signed up for, but hopefully you're learning stuff. Okay, so I fixed that. Well, let's go back to the drawing. And what about this area down here? You'll notice on mine, it shelled it out. In fact, I'm going to turn on my section analysis. You can kind of see, sure enough, it shelled that area out. So could I try doing a new offset here? I could try, but I'm worried about this fillet. I'm afraid that would cause potential issues, but let's just see what happens here. I'm going to go ahead and save. Let me put this in my Tech Thursdays, sorry, and I'll just call this 756. Okay, save often, make sure you do that. So I'm going to grab this face, and let's do the press pull. And we know that we don't want it to be automatic. We don't want it to be modify existing. I'm going to say new offset. Well, how far do I need to go? Well, I want to know what this edge length is right there. So I'm going to measure from that face to that face. And notice what it did. And I'll back up so you can kind of see what I did there. But I didn't know what that thickness was. In fact, let me cancel. I didn't know what this thickness was. And if I click on that, it tells me what the radius is, but it doesn't tell me the distance from this face to this face here. I wanted to do, well, by selecting them, it tells me that the minimum distance is 5 millimeters. So what I did is I came in here and I said press pull, and I want it to go that exact distance. So I don't know what that is. So I'm going to come in here and say measure. I want to know the distance from that face to this face. Now here's another tip. You'll notice I clicked on a face here, and you'll notice I'm trying really hard to click on a face here. I recommend selecting like items. So if you're clicking a face, measure to another face. If you're clicking on an edge, measure to another edge. It just, I think, gives you better results. So I said measure, I clicked those two things, and you can see that sure enough, that thickened. And that looks more like what our drawing looks like. However, it's a sharp edge right here, okay? Now, did I create this fillet? No, the shell actually created that fillet from this fillet here. So I can't really like come in here and say change this fillet. So all I'm gonna do is select on it, right mouse click, and say delete. I want to delete that fillet off of my design, and sure enough, there we go. Okay, and it added that feature in my timeline. I could always unsuppress that. I'm gonna just drag before it. I can always unsuppress it and bring it back if we decide, hey, we want that to be, you know, scalloped or whatever on the inside. Okay, cool. So I've basically fixed what this drawing is supposed to look like. So I know it took a couple steps. I could have drawn my profile to have all, you know, basically this shaded in area, this hatched area. I could have drawn my profile like that and then revolved it around and it'd be hollow on the inside. But man, I would have had to have a lot more dimensions. I'd have to have some chamfers. I'd have to maybe offset some faces and stuff like that. There's absolutely nothing wrong with doing it 3 different ways. Use the shell command. Don't use the shell command. Try a complex sketch. Try a simple sketch. Can I get to the same spot using a couple features instead of a 20-minute sketch that I've created? Okay. Okay, so I'll come back here. Let's turn off our section analysis. Let's go ahead and do these holes and look like they're a diameter of 12. They didn't give me a quantity. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, 13, 14, 15, 16, 17, 18. Looks like 18 holes. 12, and did they give me a location? They did not. Okay, so interesting. Poorly created drawing. I apologize. I'm going to figure out how to put these holes directly centered on this little flange right here. So typically you would see a circle that goes through all these and a radius that defines what that would be. So diameter 12, and we'll put it on this face right there. Okay, I see this question a lot. Should I go back to my original sketch? Well, I can't, right? I can't. I did my sketch on my front plane and I need to do it on my top plane. So some people like to have the minimal number of sketches as possible. Okay, so I'm obviously going to have to create a sketch. Now, should I create it on that face or should I create it on that face? And in all honesty, it doesn't really matter. It's really up to you. I kind of like to look at, so for example, I'm looking down on this view right here. So we're kind of looking down into the part. So that's kind of how I like to do my sketches. So I would look down onto my part if my sketch was on that face. I'd be looking up into my part if my sketch was on that face. And again, this is just personal preference. but I'm going to create a sketch on that top face there, this flange face, I should say. Okay. I'm going to go ahead and create a circle, and I have no idea where it's supposed to be. I'm going to purposely draw it in the wrong spot, and I know it's a diameter 12, so we know that. So I'm going to go ahead and type in 12. Okay. Now I mentioned I want it to be equal distance, or centered, I should say, on these two rings. So how could I do that? Well, here's a really cool trick. I'm going to draw a line, okay? Now, once again, I'm going to mess up so you can visually see what's going on. I'm going to draw a line kind of at an angle like so, okay? Well, I want that point to be touching that edge. So I could, here's another trick for you guys, I could come in here and say, I want that point to be coincident with that edge. And notice what it does. It kind of snaps that point, and no matter what I do with that point now, you'll notice it's always staying on that edge. Okay? Well, here's my trick. Some people are like, do I use coincident? Do I use collinear? What do I use here? Well, just grab the point and drag it to that edge, and you'll notice it's kind of hard to see a little X appear. So I'm just grabbing the point in space, and I'm dragging it and dropping it onto that edge. And Fusion figured out to make a coincident constraint. It looks kind of similar to that icon there, kind of different orientation, but you kind of get the idea. So I'm going to do the same thing here. I'm just going to click and drag to that point. I could do the same thing here. I'm just going to click and drag, to that point there. You'll see that it snaps right to it. And if I were to move that point, that circle has to stay coincident with that point. So my point here is sometimes you don't even have to know which constraint should you use. Let Fusion pick it for you. So just drag the line to the edge and see what happens. Drag the circle to the center of another circle and see what happens. And it'll try and create the correct constraint for you automatically. Okay, so, sorry, guess I'm running out of time here. I'm going to undo back a little bit. Let's put the circle there. Okay, so the next thing I want to do is I want that line to be vertical. So I'm going to say horizontal vertical. Now notice where it went, okay, but it is vertical. Okay, well now I want that line to be vertical with the center. So I'm going to click on horizontal vertical. I'll say that point, actually, so you'll notice it says constraint has already been applied. Let me, sorry guys, let me do that again. I'll say horizontal vertical. I'm going to click on that line and you'll see constraint has already been applied to the selected sketch object. I'm clicking on the line. Well, let's try this. I'm going to say horizontal vertical. Let's click a point. And notice I didn't get an error message, and I'll say that point there. And it jumped across. Okay, I'm going to undo. So what was different there? When I said horizontal vertical and I clicked on this line, I'm basically telling Fusion, I want that line to be horizontal or vertical. Well, it already is. And that's what it was complaining about. Because I said, I want this line to be vertical, okay? What I really mean to say is I want this point and this point to be vertical with each other. And you'll see how it moves it over to the vertical position there. It is no longer cyan or blue, so we know that that's fully constrained, okay? And this is an object line, so I'm going to click on it and say I want that to be a construction line instead. So now it's not an object line like the circle is and stuff like that. Now I want this to be exactly centered, so I'm going to come in here and say midpoint. I want that point to be lined up. I'm going to click way up here just to prove a point. You'll notice that it moved it over to the midpoint of that line. Okay, I'm going to undo to show you my little tip again. I'm not in any constraint command. The circle is not where it's supposed to be, and I want it to be centered on this line. So I come over here and you can see it sort of snap and slide up and down that line. So that's it, basically doing a coincident. But watch what happens when I get near the middle. You can kind of see it snap, and it's really hard to see. But there, let me maybe try that again. I'll do it closer. I'm going to grab this guy. It's going to get near the line, so I know it's coincident. But watch what happens here. And I can't really point to it, but there's a little blue triangle just probably about 11 o'clock from my mouse. Okay, so that's a visual confirmation that it's snapping to the midpoint. Okay, and then when I drop it, I can see that triangle icon right there, and so I know that that is snapped to the midpoint. Okay, so there's two methods here. I could, oh, big thunderclap. Sorry about that. My dog just freaked out. There's two methods here. I can physically say, I want this to go from midpoint to this point here. And I see I'm actually clicking those 2 points. Or I can just drag what I want, and Fusion is going to try and build those constraints for me. Some people like to visually see, you know, I'm way out here. I say midpoint from here to here, and I even click way up here, knowing that, hey, it did snap to the midpoint. Or you can just, if you're comfortable with this, get it near and see it snap and drop, and then confirm that that is definitely the midpoint. So I'm going to say finish sketch. Okay. Okay. Now, I could also do two different things here. Again, multiple different methods. I could just extrude this guy. Oops, sorry. I could say extrude. And I like to start to drag in the direction that it's supposed to go. And I'm going to say, instead of distance, now, I've actually been corrected a couple times, and I appreciate all of you guys making comments like this. I'll usually click a face and say extrude to that face. But what if that face changes? Or what if the whole thickness of the part changes? It's almost better to always, let me switch back here, to say go through all or to object. Okay? So let me show you what this does. I'm going to say to object, and I'm going to click on that face. And what it's going to do is it's going to always extrude to this face. Now, if this face changes and comes way down here, 10 more inches, that hole will extend all the way down. By just saying distance and clicking on, let me clear out of here so you can kind of see what's going to happen here. So I'll say extrude. Just by clicking on this guy, you can see it's putting a distance of 8 millimeters in there. Well, if this were to add 10 more millimeters in thickness, this would still only go 8 millimeters. So it is better to come in here and say go through all, which means it'll go whatever distance it needs to go, or to say to object and click that face. So I definitely recommend doing that. Okay. So here I used a circle and I extruded it. I could also have, let me back up a step. I'll turn my sketch back on, and even though I drew a circle, I could come in here and say, let's create a hole. And you'll notice it says face or sketch points. So I can click on that point right there and specify that's supposed to be 12. Okay. Now you'll notice it's asking like how thick does it need to go or how deep. I could say go through all, and it will figure out what distance it needs to go, and it will always go through that distance. Now, what's the difference? Oops, sorry, let me do that again. Let me go create hole. So sketch point, I'll say okay. Specify 12. I'll just leave the distance for now. I'll say okay. Let me turn off my sketch. So what's the difference? Well, in here I have a sketch of a circle, and that's totally fine and stuff like that. But what if I want to make a change? What if we decide, that we want this to be a chamfered hole or a counterbore hole or whatever, it is much faster to come back and edit this feature and say, I want that to be a countersunk hole. Let me just say okay, and you'll see, sure enough, it's countersunk. Or I want it to be a counterbored hole, and we can specify what size counterbore it's supposed to be, all that kind of stuff. I picked the wrong one. But you get the idea, okay? Or I could say I want it to be a tapped hole or a through hole or a blind hole. It just gives me a lot more options using the hole feature or the hole command. So I personally recommend using the hole command, and we'll come back and change these here in a little bit. Okay, running short on time, but we'll get this. We're getting close because patterning is really powerful. I'm going to come in here and say, let's create a circular pattern. Now, notice it says faces. Now, in here, there is only one face. However, if it was counterbored or countersink or whatever, blind, etc., there'd be multiple faces. So instead of doing faces, I'm going to say, I want to pattern some features. And I want to pattern this hole feature. And it will select any and all of the faces of that hole feature. In this case, it's only one, but that's okay. What's my axis? Well, I could click I could click this face, I could click this edge, I could click the axis of my origin. It really doesn't matter, okay? I'm going to go ahead and say maybe this outside face right here. And we can see it gives me a preview of 3 circles. You'll also notice this little slider icon. If I click and drag, you'll see there's a plus symbol and a minus symbol. So as I keep dragging, you'll see it's going to add or subtract the quantity. So that's kind of cool. Or I can come in here and say, I want 18. I'll say okay. And we now have those holes. And here's the power of using the hole command. I'm going to go back and say, I want this to be countersunk. I'll say okay. And it will countersink all of those holes for me. Okay? Because I said pattern the hole feature, the HOLE feature. And by doing that, now that it has a chamfer on it, it's going to pattern that also. If I were to come back and say, I want that to be a counter bore, and so that's a diameter 12, let's make this a diameter of 15, and yeah, I'll just do something like that. I'll say okay. You'll notice that all of the holes are counterbored. So I find that much, much easier than doing a circle and then patterning that and then having to select all those profiles, etc. So little tip, I recommend using the hole feature when possible. So I'm going to switch that back. Let's just do a simple hole here. Okay, we got that done. So let's take a look. So the next thing is all of these little slots. And we can see that they're 38 millimeters up from the bottom. And they're 20 millimeters wide. But then they look like they taper back a little bit. So that is pretty interesting. I'm going to have to figure out how would I go about doing this. Okay. So let's try a couple different methods here. So I'm going to, and it doesn't give me, does it give me the overall height? It does not give me how tall these are. Ugh. Again, jeez, I'm gonna have to make an assumption. Don't see it. Okay, so 38 from the bottom. So let's do this. So I'm going to come in here and let's try a couple different methods. So I'm gonna say offset plane. I'm gonna click the bottom. And then I'm gonna start to drag. And what this is gonna do is it's gonna let me create a construction plane a certain distance from the bottom. Now I can see it's in the negative direction, so I want to make sure I keep that. I'm going to say minus 38. And sure enough, this plane is now 38 millimeters from the bottom of the part. So I'm just going to go ahead and say OK. Let's just kind of take a look at the top here. Okay. It gives me a radius. So if I bring this here, it gives me a diameter of where the top of these are. So here I was looking for a height, and I glanced down and I saw, okay, it gives me a diameter of 123. And I'm going to maybe draw this top one right here so I can kind of see that's perfectly lined up with a center line. So let's just take a look at that. I'll go back to Fusion. I'm going to click on that plane and let's just create a sketch on that plane. So our piece of paper is now 38 millimeters up from the base, okay? So I'll still look at the top view. I'll go ahead and create a circle. And it is a diameter of 123. So I type in 123, there it is. Now, this is an object line. I really don't want it to be an object line. Maybe I'll turn it to a construction plane, okay? Then what I want to do is basically create a rectangle that is 20 millimeters wide. So I'm just gonna draw a line like so. Now I could do a rectangle. Well, actually, yeah, let's go ahead and do a rectangle. I'll say rectangle, and I'm just gonna draw something in here like so, okay? Again, I purposely made it the wrong size. I could come in here and say dimension. I know the overall width is supposed to be 20, so I'm gonna say 20. Maybe I'll drag this over a little bit so we can kind of see what's going on here. Now I want this to be perfectly lined up. So you might say, okay, use the midpoint. So if I say I want the middle of this line to be lined up with the middle of this green line, you'll notice that there isn't one there. I can't click on it. I can click this point here, but watch what happens. It brings my rectangle all the way down. Now in this case, that might not be an issue. In fact, I'm going to make this extremely big right here, okay? What I care about is where this line is all the way to basically this edge right here. And I'm going to machine down. I'm going to cut down. Well, this is not an object line. It is a construction line. So check this out. I'm going to change that back to an object line, okay? Also, if I turn off my body, you'll notice my profile does not give me all of the information that I need. I need to know where that edge is, and I need to know where that edge is, etc. So if, again, I'll turn this off, you'll notice I don't know where that edge is, so my profile is way too big. So I'm going to use the project command, P for project. And you'll notice I have some options, specified entities or body. Well, if I click on the body, it's going to basically do like a silhouette of the whole body, and I don't want that. I want a specific entity. In fact, that specific entity is that line right there. So I'm going to click on that line and say OK. Now if I turn off my body, you'll notice I now have a trapped profile, okay? So it's from this 123 diameter radius, or sorry, diameter circle, all the way to this edge. So now I'll say finish sketch. And again, I don't know if this is the correct solution. I'm hoping it is. You notice it's not letting me select my profile. It's trying to select faces, and I want to select that profile. So another tip I've shown is if you click and hold for about a second, it probes through. So the first thing it's going to hit is a face, then there's the inside face, and then there's the profile. Okay, so instead of having to come over here and figure out which body it is, turn it off, click on my profile, say extrude, then turn my body back on again, etc. Okay, so you see the result we get. Instead, I like to basically probe through. So you need to make sure you're pointing in the right direction. I can see my profile right there. Click and hold. Boom, we're done. I've selected that profile. I didn't have to turn any bodies on or off. Then I can come in here and say extrude. So let's go ahead and extrude this up. Now, again, how far? Well, I could say to object. And I could click on that face there, and you'll notice it didn't work. Tool body creation failed. And you're like, well, that doesn't make much sense. Why did it do that? Well, notice it gave us some options under the to, and it says like extend faces or chain faces. And you can actually, it's kind of hard to see the icon, but you can see how this profile kind of follows that edge where this one kind of just stops. So I'm going to try this chain faces and see if that gives me a different result. And sure enough, it does. Okay, so what was happening with this first option is it was basically extruding it until it hit that inside face right there, that inside angled face. Okay, so if you ever see something like that, try a couple of the options, and I've always had really good luck with this chain faces. So I'm going to go ahead and say OK, and there we go. Okay, now what about angling these faces right here? Well, I couldn't have drawn, I mean, maybe I could have, but let me see, looking from the top view, I could have maybe drawn my sketch instead of a rectangle. I might have been able to draw an angle, but I like, again, to keep my sketches simple, I like to use commands such as like draft. Okay, now it's asking for a draft plane. Well, because this is centered, I can actually, let me rotate it this way, I can grab that as my draft plane. So it's basically what's going to mirror, and you'll see this here in just a second. So what face do I want to chamfer, or draft, I should say? Well, I'm going to come in here and select, hopefully, select this face. And you'll notice it is not letting me select that face. So, oops, how do I get around doing this? Okay, could not taper surface as requested. Interesting. Okay, so maybe what I need to do is maybe put the plane here. Again, this is live. Who knows if this is going to work or not. So I might say I want to do a plane. Let's do a mid plane between that face there and this face here. And maybe it's because of the shape of this. It's not going to let me draft. I'm curious. So let's come in here and say draft. This is my draft plane. What are my faces? And it doesn't look like, let me see if it will. It's not going to let me draft that face. So unfortunately, what I was hoping would be simple is not going to be in this case. Now, I'm going to try one more thing. Maybe it's because this face, you know, is curved and all that kind of stuff. So let's try something here. I'm going to, let me come in here. Let me see what could I do here. I'll try splitting the face. I'm going to grab that face there. What is my splitting tool? I might just try this blend. I'm just kind of curious what's going to happen here. Let me see if I get anything. Nope. What I was hoping to do is to get a line right here. Okay. So let's try doing something a little bit different. I'll say offset plane. And I want it to go to that point right there. So I started it here and I said I want it to jump to that intersection right there. I'm going to go ahead and say okay. Now let's see if I can oops, split my face. So I'm going to say that's the face I want to split. What's my splitting tool? I'll say that's my splitting tool, and I'll say OK. And you'll notice I now have an edge right there. So even though this was one continuous face, I've split that face right there. Okay. Now what I'm curious about, will this work? Let me turn off my construction. Let's try a draft. And let's try drafting around that plane. What is the face? I'm going to say that face, and notice I'm able to angle that face. Okay. And it's basically pivoting around that edge, or this plane, I should say, is hinging on that plane. So I know that that works now. So let's go ahead and split the other side. So I'll come in here and say split face. And I'll click on that guy, splitting tool, that guy there. I'll say OK. I can now see that that's an individual face. We'll do the draft. What do we want to hinge our faces on? I'm going to say that plane there. What are the faces? I'm going to do both of these faces at the same time. So I'm going to select both of those, and you can kind of see how they draft in together. And according to the drawing, it's 7 degrees. So I'm going to go ahead and type in 7 and say OK. And that leaves us with that there. Let me go ahead and turn off my construction. Okay, so now I want to copy that all the way around. So let's use the pattern command again. So I'm going to do a circular pattern. Again, I want to make sure I'm doing features. Now, what features do I want to do? And we're going to potentially run into an issue here. I want to, so that's a split face, that's a split face. So here's the extrude. So I obviously want to pattern the extrude. I'm going to see if I can select, so I can't select that guy. I'm going to see if I can select those split faces. I can. And I'm going to see if I can select that draft, which I can. So you'll notice it let me select a bunch of different features except for the plane, which kind of makes sense in this case. So let's see what happens. I've selected all of those features. What's my axis? Again, I'm probably going to pick the same axis I selected before. And I'm assuming there's, yep, they look like they match the holes. So I'm going to type in 18. I'll say OK. And let's see what this does, if it allows us to do this. And sure enough, it did. So Brad's happy. Okay, so what we did there is selected multiple items in the timeline. And you can do that with the pattern. Now let me undo. I'm going to go ahead and undo. Could I have done this? Let me go pattern, circular pattern. Could I have done it with just faces? I probably could. So let's just try that. I'm going to say faces. I'm going to rotate it so there's no other faces in the way or anything like that. So I'm going to kind of rotate it like this. I'm just going to draw a box around that selection area, and you can see that it selected all of those faces. Let's do the same thing. Same axis, same number. I'll say 18. I'll say OK. And that worked also. Which is better? Well, what happens if I came back and made a change to the draft or something like that? So let's just change this draft from 7 to, like, let's just say 9 or something. Let's try 12. Let's just make it a lot more pointed. I'll say OK. So that did work. So which is better? I can't answer that question. I personally like using the features, and you saw that example with the hole feature, where if I changed it to a counterbore hole or a blind hole or something like that, if you add more faces to that by making that change, but doing the feature, it'll do it fine. If I had said select these 10 faces and pattern them around, and then I change one of those and it adds 2 more faces, it might complain. So I personally recommend using the features. Okay, so I'm looking at this and we have a cool part that looks just like the model here. So, or the drawing, I should say. So the last thing I would do in this case was maybe, pick the correct material. So I might come in here and say physical material. Maybe this is made out of like carbon steel. So I'm gonna go into my metals. Let's just go into steel. And there's carbon steel. So I'm gonna drag that onto there. Say okay, and you can kind of see it changed color a little bit. But the reason I do that is I can now come in here and go to my properties, and it will tell me how much this thing weighs right there, because it's made out of carbon steel. I can find where the moment of inertia is and all this kind of stuff. It's pretty cool. So you can kind of see carbon steel. Okay. And we ran out of time. I could simulate this and determine, are these little arms, wide enough to withstand the weight and all that kind of stuff? Who knows? But what was fun about this, and you have to trust me, a Scout's honor, I have not practiced this. This was live. We were supposed to be doing something with Angelo on cam, but unfortunately his computer was giving him some fits. So we'll try and reschedule that because his topic is really, really cool. How to set up the setup on your cam part or whatever. So we'll try and reschedule that hopefully for next week. So keep an eye out for that. I want to thank you everybody for hanging on for an extra couple minutes. I want to thank you for putting up with, hey, how come this didn't work? How do we resolve that? And hopefully you learned something from this. Even us Fusion experts or gurus or wizards or whatever term you guys use, which we always get a kick out of, we might hit a stumbling block here and there, and we have to figure out what makes the most sense. How should I make this part? So with that, thank you and have a wonderful rest of your day.